This is the Storytrails podcast. Listen in as we explore India through her stories. Every side has a story to tell. Was the Red Fort entirely red when it was first built? Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Storytrails podcast, exploring India through her stories. In today's episode, we will take you through the stories of Lal Killa, more popularly known as the Red Fort Complex, Delhi. My name is Vijay Prabhat Kamlakara, and I have my Storytrails colleagues with me, Akila and Kaushik.
Hi everyone.
Hi, hello.
And today we have with us a very special guest who will help us demystify some of the structures within the Red Fort complex. We are delighted to have with us Anisha Shekar Mukherjee. Anisha is an architect from the School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi. She did her master's in architectural conservation at the De Montfort University, Leicester, UK. Anisha now is the director of Ambi Knowledge Resources Private Limited and is visiting faculty at the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. Welcome to the Story Trails podcast, Anisha. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and to speak about the Red Fort with all of you.
Now, before we put our questions to Anisha and listen to her stories, we have a question for all you listeners. And we are not making it an easy one, are we, Akila?
No, really, it's not that difficult. If you know the story, that is. Just see if you can solve this riddle and tell us what we are referring to. A covered market at the entrance to the fort, it screamed out the riches of the Mughal court, selling the finest of wares from all over the realm, jewelry, silks, and spices, enough to overwhelm. An opulent showcase of an empire at its peak. The women in the harem had it to themselves once a week. What are we talking about?
What are we talking about? Now, just to be clear, there are no prizes to be won, and you don't have to rush into sending your answers anywhere. If you get the answer right, give yourselves a pat on the back.
That's good enough for a gift.
Right. So, Red Fort, we all know, is a monument that tells many stories of love and hatred, of riches and grandeur, and many, many tragic tales. But let's start at the very beginning. Who started it all and when?
Well, I think it would be fairly well known to say that the Red Fort was built by the Mughal emperor Shah Jahan. But did you know that in his 30-year reign, Shah Jahan built not just this, but four of the grandest Mughal monuments of all time?
Taj Mahal?
Yes, definitely. The Taj Mahal was there. And beyond that, there were the Jama Masjids, one in Delhi and Agra, and there was this fort. See, the Red Fort was completed in 1648 and it was built to be the royal palace of the emperor. And the city that came up around it became the new Mughal capital. It was named Shah Jahanabad and soon housed over 2 million people.
Just to put that number in perspective, that is more than twice the population of London and Paris of that time combined together.
Wow. But then that is not all that surprising, is it? The mighty Mughal Empire was at its peak at that time. And back then, wasn't India the largest economy in the world?
It was. And China was a close second. See, you have all that money, it's waiting to be spent. So, what's better than building a super massive house for himself and all his descendants?
Yeah, can't fault him for that really. But then I read that the Red Fort cost over 10 million rupees back then.
The Taj Mahal Vijay cost thrice as much. But then the Red Fort is much, much bigger.
Yeah, that's right. It actually extends for 3 kilometers on either side of the main entrance. If you have ever been to the Colosseum in Rome, imagine something 50 times that size.
Wow, that sounds really grand. But then why did Shah Jahan decide to build something so massive? And why in Delhi? Anisha?
Well, Vijay, thank you for the question. And before I answer that, these fascinating, figures and facts that all of you presented to us, is just a couple of points I'd like to add to that. So the first is that it wasn't as if all the Mughal emperors after Shah Jahan stayed in the Red Fort. Aurangzeb's son Bahadur Shah I is believed to have never set foot inside the Red Fort. In fact, he's believed to have never really set foot inside Delhi, and because he was away on campaigns and conquests throughout his reign, which was relatively short compared to that of Aurangzeb. And the second thing is that though most of the fort in the city were finished in a period of 10 years, from the commencement of construction, there were certain parts of the city and the fort which continued to be made after Shah Jahan and his entourage had moved into the new capital. Now, as to your question about why did Shah Jahan build such a massive fort, the first thing is why did he build a fort at all? Because there were existing forts in Agra and Lahore, and Shah Jahan had lived there and had got structures added there. So there are two main reasons that are ascribed to the reason for the capital to be moved to Delhi. And the first is that Agra had got very crowded. It was a city that had grown over time, and it couldn't accommodate all the court ceremonial that went with the Mughal emperor's uh, routine. There were perhaps other reasons, which was the first was that Delhi had this attraction for the Mughals because it had been an imperial capital. It was associated with both childhood of Akbar, Humayun, and the place where their ancestors were buried. Humayun's tomb, for instance, was here, and it's also a very important site of pilgrimage. So even the earlier Mughal emperors, when they moved, they would stop at Delhi to the shrine of Nizamuddin Aulia and other peers. So it was a very important site. And then, just like Agra, Delhi was disposed on the banks of the Yamuna, and it was the very rich sort of the Yamuna and Gangetic plain were here, which was a very important source of revenue.
Right. So it made sense for Shah Jahan to move his capital from Agra to Delhi, and Delhi was a good choice. But why do you think Shah Jahan decided to build the Red Fort at that particular time? There must have been some trigger.
I think the Red Fort was planned during this very interesting juncture in Shah Jahan's reign.
Mhm.
See, by now he was a middle aged emperor. He had suffered reverses in the Deccan. Worse still, he was very deeply affected by the loss of his wife, Mumtaz Mahal.
Hmm.
So, when he finally decided to come back to the affairs of the state, he came up with two announcements. First, he announced the construction of the Taj
Hmm.
Mahal, this white marble mausoleum for his wife, and secondly, the construction of a new capital city in Delhi, about 200 kilometers away from Agra.
Which one came up first, Red Fort?
I think they both almost came up at the same time. The Taj took some time to build, that's all.
Hmm.
Interestingly, did you know that both the monuments, the Taj Mahal and the Red Fort, were built by the same architect, a man named Ustad Ahmed Lahori?
Is that so?
Well, again, there are lots of things to answer here. So the first is that the reason we speak of the Taj Mahal and the Red Fort in the same breath is, yes, they had a common sort of creator. But the thing to also remember is that construction and design in that time didn't happen in the way it did today. So it was a very collaborative and team effort. So unlike today's design process where you have like star architects who sort of lay out everything, it was a collaborative process, and a good deal of design happened independently.
But it is amazing, isn't it? The pearl like white Taj with its delicate carvings and its lacy marble work, and this big, bold, bright red fort created by the same man.
Though we think of them as very different, there are parts of the Red Fort, the imperial parts of the Red Fort, the public imperial domain and the private imperial domain, which actually was very similar to the Taj Mahal in the sense that they were buildings in white marble with exquisite inlay of semi-precious stones and beautiful, very very delicate and intimate scale. What you have to remember is the Red Fort is far more complex than the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal is essentially it's a mausoleum set in a garden, and the Red Fort is, it's a palace for the emperor. It's and his large family. It's an administrative center with halls of public and private audience. It is a place where the Mughal military resides. It's a place where there are karkhanas, imperial workshops. There are royal, bazaars. There are gardens. There are huge orchards.
Doesn't sound like a fort at all.
Yes, that is true. Two very different buildings built around the same time by the same man, but for very different purposes. One white and the other red. But the Red Fort wasn't always red, was it?
Don't think of plain red all the way. See, the outer walls and the ramparts, they were red because it was made out of brick and sandstone. And then there were marble buildings inside, which were all white. And then there were some other buildings inside, which were just plastered over with white lime plaster.
Hmm.
So, this white lime plaster gave that lovely smooth feel of
Right.
marble. And some of these buildings were apparently gilded with gold too. But that was during Shah Jahan's
Hmm.
time. As time went, all that plaster crumbled and it exposed the red brick underneath. Unfortunately, the later Mughal kings, they did not have enough money for its upkeep, so it became just almost red.
So, right. So not red fort, but
Mhm.
reddish fort. Right. But then
Okay.
it's quite ironic, isn't it? After all that expense and effort, Shah Jahan didn't live at the Red Fort for very long, did he?
Yes, I mean he barely completed a decade at the Red Fort, so and which is sad because he fell ill and he was unable to actually attend court for a week, and he suppressed the information about his health, which led to rumors that he's dead, and therefore there became this all-out race. And then Dara Shikoh conveyed Shah Jahan to Agra, ostensibly for the reason that he would be better off there, his health would improve there. And then after that, Shah Jahan never came back to Delhi. He lived, even after Aurangzeb took over the emperorship, but he didn't ever come back to Delhi, and he died.
That's true. The Red Fort was just 10 years old when it found itself smack in the middle of a very bloody power struggle between the emperor's children. When Shah Jahan lost Mumtaz, his children, a brood of very ambitious boys and girls, they found themselves quite lost and they all competed for their father's favor. And as they grew, their enmity grew along with them until they went all out competing for the throne of Delhi. Now, Shah Jahan was quite aware of this, so he publicly declared his eldest son his heir.
That's Darashiko.
That's right, Prince Dara Shikoh. He hoped to prevent the princes from fighting with each other.
Hmm.
But it didn't really work. He was quite helpless when his younger son, Aurangzeb, imprisoned him in the Agra fort and then he slaughtered his brothers ruthlessly. And then he established himself on the Mughal throne.
Yes, that is a tragic tale and definitely a story for another day. But did the coming of Aurangzeb change anything at the Red Fort, Anisha?
Well, yes, in many ways it did. Though in his initial years, the manner in which the fort was used was very much like in Shah Jahan's time, in the first decade of his reign. But what happened in Aurangzeb's reign was that overall the changes that he instituted in the physical design of the Red Fort, they seem to be small, but actually they had a huge effect. So the first thing that he did was, you see, before he moved into the Red Fort was actually the main Lahori Gate and the Delhi Gate, the two main public gateways into the fort, were in line with the two main public urban axes, the urban streets of Shah Jahanabad. So, metaphorically and spatially, the emperor was accessible to his people all the time. And also, there was there were certain days set aside where anybody could enter till the Dhivani Arm and actually gain audience with the emperor. So, there were various reasons. There were urban design reasons, there were reasons of let's say symbolic sort of association with his people. There were reasons of governance. All of them came together to have this direct spatial and visual access. And what Aurangzeb did was, because his concerns were more to with defense rather than urban design or anything like that, so he got this barbican, he got a battlemented wall created in front of the Lahori Gate entrance.
Yes, that's right. So what was originally designed as a very open and accessible structure suddenly had a very giant screen at the entrance.
Yeah, I mean it's not just a screen, it's like it's an opaque wall. It's You block that access. Yes, so instead of going straight through, through to the forecourt over a bridge into the fort itself, you had to turn left and then turn right again, and there was a smaller gateway. So the indirect access was made, which was, which is one of the ways. It's one of the time honored sort of ways of defense into entrance into a fort. But because Shah Jahan was ruling at a time which was relatively stable, he did not envisage any requirement for such defensive needs. And the fort, in any case, was more of an urban fort than a really defensive fort. So he had, for good reasons, hadn't made such a staggered entrance, which Aurangzeb instituted. So doing this, blocked the entrance, and Shah Jahan is reported to have written to him from his imprisonment in Agra, "Dear son, you have made the fort a bride and put a veil upon your face."
Yeah, That sounds like the perfect metaphor. The Barbican is like a veil drawn across the fort. But even inside the fort, wasn't there a clear demarcation between the public and the private spaces? See,
Hmm.
there were parts that were accessible to ordinary citizens, and there were parts that were exclusive to a very select few. Actually, it was more of a palace than a fort. It's such a huge, sprawling campus, actually.
Yes, clearly it was. Now, for listeners who have never been to the Red Fort, let me tell you about the main parts of the fort. So, there is a structure called the Dhivani Arm, which is the public court, which is where the emperor heard the common man's grievances. So, any common man could go until there, but no further. Beyond that is the Divani Khas, which is the hall meant only for nobles and high ranking courtiers. Then there is the Khas Mahal, which are the private quarters of the king himself. And finally, there was a structure called the Rang Mahal or the Harem, which is where all the women lived. Let's talk a little more about the Rang Mahal. Tell me, is it true that it housed over 5,000 women?
Yes, apparently in Akbar's time, that's about 30 years before Shah Jahan, it had as many as 5,000 women,
Hmm.
women of all ages and ethnicities. But it is not what like you're probably imagining it to be.
Mhm.
Look, this royal harem, or the zanana as it was called, was housed in one part of the Red Fort called the Rangmahal. And this Rangmahal was like a mini city in itself, big,
Hmm.
bustling, and so totally out of bounds for every adult male.
Except the emperor, of course.
Yes, yes, except the emperor, of course.
And it had a hierarchy built in. It was all presided over by the Queen Mother herself. Then came the other queens, then the princesses, then, of course, the mistresses. Each of these women had an army of female servants, and they too lived in the zanana.
And let's not forget the
Hmm.
eunuchs. They were specially employed to maintain security and discipline inside the zanana. See, they were the only ones who had access, isn't it, to both the men's and the women's
Right.
quarters. So apparently, every time the emperor married, the new queen would arrive with one large retinue of
Hmm.
servants. And when new territories were conquered, there was a whole sea of new slave girls and servants who would be brought up and set up inside the zanana. You must remember, all the royal children were born inside the zanana. And young princes, they too stayed right here until they became men.
And the princesses too, right?
Yes, of course. In fact, the princesses left only if they married off outside the family, which, by the way, was quite rare. Many of the Mughal princesses ended up as spinsters.
Uh-huh.
That included all three of Shah Jahan's daughters who never married.
I wonder why though. I do remember reading somewhere that the daughters of the Mughal emperors, it seems they were actively discouraged from marrying. Is that true?
Not exactly. Some people think that there was a rule that banned princesses from marrying and having children
Hmm.
because that would create additional claimants to the throne.
Right.
But the truth is that Mughal princes could marry, but typically only within the family.
Hmm.
This was the Mughal way of keeping the royal lineage pure, which often meant marrying cousins.
And then there was another problem too, isn't it? The fight for the throne was so intense that every time a new ruler ascended the throne, he would first kill off all the competition to secure his reign.
Hmm.
You must remember, both Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb did this. The result was that there are very few men left to marry, even if the princesses could or wanted to. And the boys who remained, they were spared because they were too young to cause any problems. And well, too young to be husbands at least.
Right. So I'm guessing the Zanana must have been a terrible, terrible place for these princesses.
Well, actually, the Mughal Zanana was quite the epitome of luxury. The princesses in there could have just about everything they desired inside those walls.
Except men, of course.
Okay, except men, of course. But at the entrance to the Red Fort, there was a market called the Nina Bazaar. And it was stocked with the choicest of things, I'm guessing, from all over the world. There were silks and spices, there were exquisite cottons, cosmetics, jewels, rare precious stones. Everything was sold here. And once a week, this market was completely closed off to the men. And the women, oh, they just shopped till they dropped.
Well, actually, it was not all over the world. What used to be available there was the best things that the Mughal craftsmen would make. So it was like a display of not just the sort of the masonry and the built form of the fort, but also I think the active sort of craft and human resources. So it would you would have all of them would be there and arrayed over there. So for both the emperors themselves perhaps to shop, as well as visitors visiting noblemen would come by. That was, remember, the public ceremonial entrance. So they would equally be awed by what the Mughal empire could produce in terms of artifacts and products, as well as by what it could build.
So, an impressive market the Nina Bazaar must have been. But clearly, most women at the Zenana must have led very unromantic lives. So, would it be right to say that the Zenana was, in essence, like a dream prison?
I think it probably was. On top of that, there was enmity and rivalry inside. There were assassination attempts and lovers on the sly. I remember Francois Bernier wrote something about the Seraglio, the Zanana, and about Shah Jahan's daughter Roshnara getting caught in a scandal.
Really?
Francois Bernier was a Frenchman who inhabited Delhi for about 6 years, and he came in when the War of Succession was happening. Initially, was with Dara Shikor's retinue, and then later, after Dara Shikor was arrested, etc., he wisely chose to move away. So he had a reputation as a physician, though I don't think he was ever trained as one. And at one point, he says that he was blindfolded and taken into the harem because there was somebody who needed the services of a physician. So, but he couldn't say how he got in, how he got out, etc. So yes, entry was very restricted for most people. Unless you had a good reason, you couldn't be there. And it was because there were a series of courtyards. It was pretty much a maze, and if you were unfortunate enough to enter, sometimes you couldn't get out safely. As also there is a story about that as well.
Yes, I remember that story. It's one bit of gossip. Let's hear it.
Well, this is again, this is sort of like double hearsay. So this is what Francois Bernier says, and he says he was told this by what he calls a Portuguese half-caste woman who was a slave in the Seraglio. So he says that once a young man made an assignation with the Princess Roshanara, who was Aurangzeb's sister, and he was sort of smuggled into the inner apartments. And then, when it was time for him to leave, he was entrusted to personal attendants of the princess, and they were told to lead him out safely. But something happened, maybe they heard some noise or whatever, so they fled and they left him somewhere in the Seraglio. And the poor man is supposed to have wandered all night trying to find a way out. And in the morning, he was still found there, which was obviously not good for him. And then he was brought before Aurangzeb, who, by all accounts, was a very stern personage. And so he asked him, how did you get in? And he didn't want to sort of implicate anybody in this. So he said, I climbed up the walls, because you remember that the fort, it's surrounded by these red sandstone walls on all sides. And on the river side, these are lower, because the imperial pavilions sit on the terrace itself, right on top of the wall. So there it's about 15 feet, 15, 20 feet lower than the rest of the sides, and there's no moat there. So he said, I climbed up from there. So the emperor says, very well, then you can descend from there.
Poor chap. That surely didn't end very well for him. Now, the Mughal kings, they were always short on trust, weren't they?
Yeah, tough times, tough measures.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little more about the structure of the Red Fort itself. Now, it was undoubtedly grand, but they also say that it is a perfectly symmetrical monument. Is that true?
It does give the appearance of being very symmetrical, but what I read somewhere, it is not perfectly symmetrical.
Correct. And the Moti Masjid is a case in point. It seems when Aurangzeb built the Moti Masjid inside the Red Fort complex, it was out of alignment with the rest of the structure. Because you see, the masjid had to be aligned with Mecca. So how do they deal with that problem? They just built a box around the mosque, just so that misalignment wouldn't show up. So if you go in even today, you can see the mismatch between the mosque and its outer shell.
Right.
But then I'm guessing it's not all that black and white.
Right. Fair enough. Now, we spoke a little earlier about how the Red Fort was both a palace and a fort, and it was not just meant for protection. But did anyone ever dare to attack this fort?
Well, several people did. The Persian king Nadir Shah, he did it as early as 1739, and he carried away the fabulous peacock throne.
Oh, right, the peacock throne. Isn't that the throne that Shah Jahan himself sat on? Tell us more.
Yes, for starters, did you know that it cost way more than the Red Fort itself cost?
Wow.
The Peacock Throne was commissioned by Shah Jahan soon after he built the Red Fort and placed in the Divane Khas. The greatest of the great Mughals had to have the blingest of all thrones, right?
Of
He
course,
did.
yes.
Yeah. So apparently, Shah Jahan used over 1,000 kilos of gold to make this throne and
Whoa.
over 200 kilos of precious stones.
including the Kohinoor diamond.
That's right, it was. And nearly all of these stones, they all came from the state treasury. So you can imagine the Peacock Throne spoke volumes about just how rich the Mughal Empire was at that time.
Absolutely. But where is that throne today?
Ah, Vijay, how I'd love to tell you it's in my house.
Akila, it won't fit into your locker.
I know. Yeah, I wouldn't know where to keep it in my house. But to answer your question, Vijay, the throne just vanished. You see,
Hmm.
after Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire weakened very swiftly. In 1739, Nadir Shah, a Persian king, attacked Delhi and looted it. They say he took back so much it needed 700 elephants, some 4,000 camels, and some more than 10,000 horses to haul that wealth back to Persia.
Wow.
And with all that wealth went the Peacock Throne and the Kohinoor Diamond. Now, soon after that, Nadir Shah himself was assassinated and the Peacock Throne disappeared. Historians suspect it was melted down and the
Oh,
stones sold piecemeal.
what a loss. But I'm guessing there were other treasures also at the Red Fort that also disappeared over time?
Yes, the Diwani Khas originally had a ceiling that was completely coated in silver. Can you imagine that grandeur?
Hmm.
In 1760, the Marathas attacked Delhi and defeated the Mughals. And with that, the mighty Mughals became vassals of the Marathas and were dependent on them for protection.
Hey, just imagine. Less than 100 years before that, under Aurangzeb, the Mughals had almost wiped out the Marathas. Aurangzeb
Right.
even had the Maratha king Sambhaji executed.
That's right, but the Marathas regrouped, and now it was the turn of the Marathas to call the shots. After they captured the Red Fort, they melted down that entire silver ceiling to fund their own war efforts.
Hmm. So was that the beginning of the end for the Red Fort?
Actually, I think the biggest blow came when the British attacked this place in 1857.
The Great Indian Mutiny.
Hmm.
Yes, the rebel forces in the Indian Mutiny, they looked upon the then Mughal king Bahadur Shah Zafar as their emperor and rallied under
Hmm.
him. See, the British besieged Delhi and they soon captured it. Bahadur Shah himself was tried and exiled to Burma. British troops entered the Red Fort. I think they just went berserk when they did
Hmm.
that. They took away everything that was valuable. They demolished many buildings, and in the place of those buildings, they built their own barracks. And Red Fort, it just became a garrison of the British.
But what happens after that is that, of course, right in the aftermath of 1857, there is complete and widespread plunder. So houses are knocked down, and temples are knocked down. They actually break idols because they've heard the story of Somnath. So one British soldier who recorded his memoirs says we broke the idol down and we did discover a cache of jewels inside. So there was like widespread plunder. But after the British moved in officially, there was it was like official plunder. So the if I don't know if you know, but the Musamman Burj had a gilded copper dome, so that was stripped. The Moti Masjid had gilded copper domes; those were stripped. They were called movable assets, and they were taken off. So there was like huge plunder, and not just were a lot of the buildings demolished, but those that were allowed to remain, everything was picked out from them. For instance, the Jharoka throne, which had these inlaid marble panels, those panels were taken out by Captain Jones, who was later Sir Jones, and he sold them to the Kensington Museum, which was later the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they were only got back much later in the earlier 20th century back to the Red Fort. So a lot of stuff was removed, both as active plunder as well as very sort of deliberate, concerted activity.
I have an accounting background, but I have never heard a more innovative definition of movable assets. Huh? Anyway, it is said that 80% of the original structure of the Red Fort was brought down by the British. What we see today is just the remaining 20%.
Yes, that's true. That spelled the end of the Mughal era, really. During Shah Jahan's time, the Red Fort was at the peak of its power, commanding immense territory, the capital of the richest kingdom in the whole world. But within just 200 years, it had shrunk to the size of of a small township. As they say, everything that goes up must come down.
Yeah, isn't there a very famous ditty about one of the later Mughal emperors? I think it goes like this: Sultanate Shah Alam, Aj Dilli Ta Palam.
Yes, it mocks the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, who died in the early 1800s. It
Yeah,
means the Sultanate of Shah Alam, whose territory spanned all the way from Red Fort to Palam,
Palam. Yeah,
a staggering 25 kilometers.
truly, how the mighty fall. Now, the Red Fort never
Seriously.
got back to its former glory after that. But let's end today's podcast talking about a time when it was still the grandest of all monuments. Remember the riddle we started today's session with?
Right. A covered market at the entrance to the fort. It screamed out the riches of the Mughal court, selling the finest of wares from all over the realm jewelry, silks, and spices, enough to overwhelm. An opulent showcase of an empire at its peak. The women in the harem had it to themselves once a
Once a
week.
week. Surely you know now what we are talking about.
Yes, the Nina Bazaar, of course. We spoke about it earlier, remember? An opulent market at the entrance of the fort. It sold the finest of wares.
And on that note, we end today's podcast. Thank you, Akila and Kaushik, and thanks for joining us, Anisha. We take away a lot from what you shared with us today.
Thank you. I was very glad to have had the opportunity to speak about the Red Fort. It's a very, very complex piece of construction, and it has many layers. And but some of them we spoke about today, and I'm so glad to have had the opportunity.
And for all our listeners, we have so many more stories to share with you. Do tune into our podcast and enjoy the mysteries, marvels, myths, and monuments that make India. How did you like this episode? Do subscribe to the Storytrails podcast and consider supporting us on Patreon. We have many more stories to tell, and you will find them in our short video series, blog, and audio tours. Links on our website www.storytrails.in. We'll meet you in the next episode with yet another exciting story.